Alrighty, everyone. It is Tuesday, July 15th, 2025. I am Michael Winkler, and this is The Mike Wink Show. So we're going to start today off with a tax change the IRS made with regards to churches and their tax-exempt status. It used to be for a long time that they were required to basically be apolitical officially. They are not allowed to officially come out and endorse certain political candidates or engage in certain types of political activity. This is exactly in line with all the other 501c3, all the other nonprofit designated tax bracket organizations in the United States all have to abide by these same rules of being generally apolitical. But it appears that the IRS says churches can endorse political candidates without losing tax exemptions. The Internal Revenue Service agreed in a court filing that churches can endorse political candidates without fear of losing their tax-exempt status. The IRS made the statement in a court case challenging the Johnson Amendment, a 1954 U.S. tax code provision that prohibits all 501c3 nonprofit organizations, including churches, from formally endorsing or opposing political candidates. In a filing Monday aimed at resolving a lawsuit between the national religious broadcasters and others against the IRS, the parties jointly agreed that churches can endorse candidates without fear of losing their tax-exempt status. The agreement likens such endorsements to a family discussion concerning candidates. The agreement likens such endorsements to a family discussion concerning candidates. I don't know what family of yours is going around asking you for donations and stuff like churches do. You know, they're based off of donations basically. They don't profit. You know, it's free to go to most churches as far as I understand. And a house of worship in good faith speaks to its congregation through its customary channels of communication on matters of faith in connection with religious services concerning electoral politics viewed through the lens of religious faith. It neither participates nor intervenes in a political campaign within the ordinary means of those words. The parties wrote in a filing in the federal court for the Eastern District of Texas, which was first reported by the New York Times. Concerning electoral politics viewed through the lens of religious faith, it neither participates nor intervenes in a political campaign within the ordinary meanings of the words. So wait, that makes absolutely no sense. None of that makes any sense at all. So basically that's saying they're making the argument that by virtue of the reasoning being through a faith-based lens, other than like a political lens or a humanitarian lens or whatever, that basically the lens through which religion is viewed through is special, and that within the context of nonprofit organizations, they should have a special case. They should have a special exemption. This is just an insane assertion, though, because like with this IRS tax change, if it stayed in place, it would become standard place for political candidates to go to these mega churches and mega mosques or whatever and try and garner support in whatever way they can. And basically, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if they go behind the scenes, they go talk to the pastor, they talk to the administration, maybe money, you know, is exchanged between hands, and the pastor comes out, you know, these mega churches and is like, oh, vote for Ted Cruz, he's awesome or something. Like, I guarantee you that is the only logical outcome of this sort of thing. And so it is insane to assert that it neither participates nor intervenes in a political campaign within the ordinary meaning of those words. But like, if moving forward, if Republican or Democrat or whatever, any campaign goes to these mega churches and tries to coordinate their endorsement, their try and get their followers to vote for them, that is literally what it is. That is literally participating and intervening in a political campaign. They're making a special pleading argument. They're basically saying churches are special, but that's insanity. That's just stupid. Especially when you connect how intertwined faith and politics is for so many people, especially on the conservative side. It is very scary, the idea that they could be, that these churches, these religions, that these have a stranglehold over these people's lives, and I would argue their minds as well. It is scary to think that, like, politics, one of the things that you would think, like, you try and keep separated from religion as much as possible, is now like becoming completely intertwined with religion and politics. Thus, communications from a house of worship to its congregation in connection with religious services through its usual channels of communication on matters of faith do not run afoul of the Johnson Amendment as properly interpreted. What seems absolutely bananas about this to me is that, like, this rule change only applies to churches and houses of worship. It doesn't apply to all 501c3 nonprofit organizations. So, for instance, you could be like a food charity organization. Maybe you have like a food bank type, physical location where people come and get food and whatnot. And maybe, let's say, the local, let's just say Republican, for instance. Let's say the local Republican governor or local Republican mayor or local Republican Congress people want to get rid of the food bank location that you have. You are not allowed, like, say you're running this food bank, you run this charity, and you just get notice, oh, they're trying to get rid of the food bank in this upcoming meeting in a month, or these elections upcoming, these candidates want to get rid of the food bank or whatever. You are not allowed to tell the people as your customers, the people coming and getting this charity service, you're not allowed to inform them, hey, you're allowed to inform them that the facility might be closed, but you're not allowed to explicitly tell them the facility might be closed as a result of the Republicans trying to close it. Therefore, you should go and vote for this Democrat or this candidate that is running against this Republican. You are not allowed to do that. But if you're a church, you are allowed to do that. That seems beyond insane to me. The amendment was named after Lyndon B. Johnson, who sponsored it in the Senate. Johnson had pushed for the rule in response to conservative nonprofits that supported a political rival. Yeah, that is the exact. So it sounds like we used to have this, and that is the reason why we changed the rules, is because it was dumb that we had. That we had conservative nonprofits that pushed for political rivals, that you had churches, that you had large swaths of the religious community and religious organizations that were leaning one way heavily and just getting all of their brain dead, like completely mentally captured followers to just go along with. And that's hugely problematic to the properly functioning of an ostensibly secular society, right? If we're supposed to be a secular country, if we're not supposed to be a theocracy, then we don't want religion like that intertwined in our electoral process to that degree. That seems very dangerous and very dumb. The amendment has rarely been enforced when it comes to churches. The Washington Post reported in 2017 that more than 2,000 pastors had publicly defied the Johnson Amendment in organized demonstrations. Only one of the pastors was investigated, and none were published, the paper reported. Okay, yeah, so this has been going on for a long time, and so this is a purely symbolic, I guess, then, or I guess it's preemptive, right? I guess maybe they're worried that this sort of religious-based endorsement is going to grow in popularity, which I could totally see that happening. And that this is strategy for the long game. Like, they're worried about maybe future Democrat governments actually enforcing the law like it's supposed to be enforced. Where are all of the law and order Republicans, that are all about the law needs to be followed to the letter, and it doesn't matter what your feelings think about the law is the law, and it needs to be followed, and it's important, and even if you don't agree with the specific law, it needs to be followed. Where are they when it comes to not enforcing the Johnson Amendment, huh? I've never heard them ever say a single word about it. Oh wait, it's because they only use the law and order argument when it's convenient. Okay, that's why. President Donald Trump has been a vocal opponent of the amendment. He vowed to get rid of it and totally destroy it at the National Prayer Breakfast in 2017, adding that doing so would allow our representatives of faith to speak freely and without fear of retribution. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, in the United States, man, it's so hard being religious. Oh, man. The victimhood mentality is just so cringy. Bro, religious people are not a victim in the United States, and anybody who thinks that is insane. Come on. While the IRS action doesn't go that far, getting rid of the amendment would require an act of Congress. It does target the specific provision Trump complained about. Lloyd Hitachi Mayer, a professor at Notre Dame Law School, said that if approved, the joint motion would technically apply only to churches that filed suit, but the language in it is basically giving the green light for churches to endorse candidates from the pulpit and not have to worry about IRS enforcement while President Donald Trump is in office. That, I think, is the most dangerous part about all of this, right? It's not that it's like a significant change in the enforcement. Like they said, they weren't really enforcing it before. But the fact that the rule was on the books in the first place meant that pastors and these churches and these religious organizations had to, be a little bit careful. They knew that there was a line somewhere in the sand and that nobody had crossed that line quite yet, but that there was a line in the sand somewhere, and that they didn't want to be the first ones to cross that line. Some of them are more willing to toe the line than others, but nobody wants to be the first one to blatantly cross the line and get consequences as a result. But if you remove this requirement, they don't even have to pretend. They don't even have to play the little game. They don't have to like toe the line. They don't have to like hold back at all. They can, in fact, it's not even a matter of holding back. This is going to be taken advantage of, right? It's not like you're restricting these churches who would otherwise endorse these candidates regularly. It's going to go beyond that, right? It's going to go beyond just them endorsing them. It's going to go to these political candidates' campaigns coming to these religious organizations to coordinate support. That seems extremely dangerous to me. Extremely dangerous and extremely like antithetical to the whole like process of a democracy, of a republic, of people voting in their representatives in a secular country. I keep coming back to the seculars. Secularism is an extremely important part of the founding of the United States, right? It's the whole point. Part of a huge reason why we founded the United States in the first place was people escaping religious persecution. The idea that you could come here and do whatever you want religiously. He predicted the move will have two major ramifications. The first is that churches that maybe were hesitant to endorse candidates have less of a reason to be hesitant, absolutely correct, and are going to feel freer to support candidates from the pulpit. That's exactly the point I was just making. The second ramification is even church leaders who don't want to get involved will feel pressure to do so from political candidates and members of their congregation, potentially putting pastors in an awkward position. I totally agree. Like I said, this is going to go beyond just like the pastor that maybe, in the heat of the moment would say a specific candidate's name or wouldn't. No, this goes beyond that. There are very real consequences of this, and it's the campaigns coming to coordinate them. It's pastors feeling like they need to do something. There'll be instead of there being a push, there's now going to be a pull. The push was the rule being in place like on paper, and the pull now is going to be the rule being removed and the potential benefits that can be gained by gaming the system in this sort of way. That pressure could include financial incentives from congregates who could try to sway churches with donations, Mayer said. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, that's absolutely true. That now churches have to worry about who, what, and if they are endorsing something politically, lest they might lose or gain economic support from their members. I don't imagine that this would happen with every churches, because there's like a spectrum of churches. Some are more progressive, some are more conservative, some are more orthodox, some are more like laissez-faire. But I wonder if amongst the upper echelon of line towers, this is going to create like an arms race sort of thing, all of them fighting over that same pool of hardcore religious extremist donation money. And so I could totally see an arms race of like who's the most conservative, who's the most insane, who's willing to be the most overtly political, an arms race amongst the upper echelon of megachurches and whatnot. The religious group's suit argued a change was necessary because churches were unfairly targeted by the amendment, and they sought to have the entire amendment declared unconstitutional. The IRS operates in a manner whereby the plaintiffs are in jeopardy or punishment if they forthrightly say that a candidate's positions are unbiblical or that another candidate's positions are consonant with biblical teachings, their suit says. I just love, I cannot get over how funny the idea is of like you're at like some hyper conservative, mega church, and the pastor is up there railing against like government programs, against feeding the poor, against housing the poor, against having access to clean water and giving homeless people services and free healthcare. I find it absolutely hilarious, the idea of them coming out in once, at the first 10 minutes of the sermon talking about like the giving of Jesus and being empathetic and the importance of giving and all that stuff and the teachings of Jesus, and then the next 10 minutes they spend talking about why entitlement programs are bad and the damn liberals and welfare and blah blah blah. Like I just can't. You can't square that circle. It's really it can be funny watching like you have one of those like a round peg and like a square brick, and you have a kid trying to jam it into the hole, but it doesn't fit. That's what this is, and it's funny. It's funny. You can't square that circle, but it's funny to think about. As part of the joint motion, the religious groups agreed to drop their constitutional constitutionality claims against the amendment as a whole, so it would still apply to other 501c3 exempt organizations, including charities and universities. Yeah, it's very altruistic, very very giving, very selfless of these religious groups. You know, these religious groups, they're all about being selfless. They're all about giving. They're all about caring about others, right? Oh, wait, as soon as it might help other 501c3 exempt organizations like those that feed poor people and give clothing to poor people and healthcare and help people pay their heating bill when they can't afford it. No. You know, as soon as we get our exemption, we don't care. You guys can go f yourselves. Complete insanity. There's absolutely no good justification for this. This is pure, like, cynical. We know the religious crowd is on our side from the perspective of the Republicans and conservatives, and so they're going to do whatever they can to capitulate to them, you know, because they know if they allow these churches to come out and endorse political candidates, it's only going to strengthen their position in the political ecosystem, that it only is going to solidify that. I would argue that a huge swath of Republicans' votes are already locked up. They're single-issue voters that are voting on guns or abortion, or they're just hyper-religious people that are, like, sucked into the weird religious trappings of the Republican Party. This will serve to lock up that religious section, that anti-abortion section. Anybody who even vaguely in that religious sphere, which is a lot of the conservative Republican movement, it'll help. They're already locked up, I would argue, but it helps lock them up even more because now it is even harder, right? Now, not only do you, if say you're like steeped in this Republican ecosystem, right? Maybe your parents are, you know, you grew up in a conservative household, your parents are conservatives, all your friends are conservatives, blah, blah, blah. Now if you have a view that's different to, you know, maybe you want to endorse a different candidate or you start to develop your own views and maybe disagree on some of these ideas that they hold, the people around you hold. Now you not only have to go against all of them, you have to go against your pastor. You have to go against your church. Now you risk getting, now in certain extreme circumstances, I would imagine people risk getting kicked out and ostracized from their community, from their church religious community for endorsing the wrong political candidate, which I would argue maybe to some extent already happened, but this is only going to increase the prevalence of that sort of thing happening. Just insanity. So stupid. Courts open door to Trump's terrifying occupying force fantasy. I must say, Donald Trump commented, "I wish we had an occupying force." It was June 1st, 2020. The president, then in his first term in office, was having a phone call with the nation's governors to discuss the ongoing Black Lives Matter protests taking place nationwide in response to the murder of George Floyd at the hands of a Minneapolis policeman. He was urging the governors to call in the National Guard in response to BLM protests in their states. Otherwise, he threatened he would do so himself. "You have to dominate, he told them, while labeling the protesters terrorists. Otherwise, he claimed, they are going to run you over." Later that morning, Trump left the White House and took his infamous walk through Lafayette Park, where members of the Washington National Guard, the FBI, and the Drug Enforcement Administration, and several other agencies joined by Guard units from a number of states confronted protesters. As I recounted in my book, Subtle Tools, protesters threw eggs, candy bars, and water bottles, while law enforcement shot rubber bullets, launched pepper balls, and fired tear gas into the crowd. Several weeks later, protests in Portland, Oregon, tested the president's resolve to send an occupying force. Although he didn't then go as far as to send in the National Guard, as he had threatened in that phone meeting, he did deploy federal agents to counter the protesters without consulting the governor of the state. 775 Department of Homeland Security agents from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and elsewhere appeared on the streets of Portland, authorized by the presidential edict to protect federal buildings. As if to intentionally blur the borderline between military and civilian authorities, the federal agents arrived dressed in black military-looking uniforms without identifying insignia and drove unmarked vehicles. The administration justified the deployment by arguing that local law enforcement was unable to effectively control the protests. Not surprisingly, Oregon Governor Kate Brown and Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler protested, claiming that local law enforcement was perfectly capable of handling the protests without federal aid, and that the presence of federal agents with their aggressive tactics, including the use of tear gas and rubber bullets, had only provoked the protesters, making the situation much worse. My understanding is that a lot of the times when police show up to these things, their whole directive is to use force as a means of reducing force, which oftentimes, unsurprisingly, doesn't work. And so, yeah, it shouldn't be surprising that a lot of the times when the cops come in, rubber bullet guns blazing, firing tear gas and stuff, that it's only going to make things worse. That doesn't seem inconceivable. That seems somewhat reasonable to me. Now, does that mean that the police should never come in and do something? Absolutely not. Of course, there are plenty, of justifiable circumstances in protests where the police should and very much should come in. But to say that they have no effect or that they don't have a provoking effect on the protesters, that's never the case, is ridiculous. Of course they do. Sound familiar? Fast forward to today in Los Angeles. Donald Trump is once again president, and immigration raids across the country are hurrying to meet the White House target of 3,000 arrests per day. This time around, Los Angeles has become the focal point of the resulting battle over federal versus state authority. In early June, responding to an outbreak of protests challenging the administration's brutal immigration raids, Trump sent 700 active duty Marines and 4,100 National Guard into that city to counter the protesters. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass, California Governor Gavin Newsom, and California Attorney General Bonta. They don't like her enough to put. They put Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass. They gave her first and last name. California Governor Gavin Newsom. They gave his first and last name. And California Attorney General Bonta. They didn't think she was deserving of a first name. Have protested resoundingly, claiming, like their Portland counterparts, that the deployment was unnecessary and counterproductive. Mayor Bass has maintained that the local authorities had the situation under control, concluding that there was no need for the National Guard. Summing up the consequences of the deployment, Governor Newsom considered them to be intentionally causing chaos, terrorizing communities, and endangering the principles of our great democracy. It is an unmistakable step towards authoritarianism. Attorney General Bonta echoed Newsom by insisting that the troops were instigating violence, not diffusing it, and suing the Trump administration for illegally taking over a state National Guard. Where all of this may be headed is anyone's guess, but Portland's attempts in 2020 to fight back against the deployment of federal agents, despite the wishes of local authorities, provide some guidance about what to expect, as well as lessons learned when it comes to the role of the courts, of dissent by local and state leaders, and of the path down which American law may be headed in relation to the president's ability to usurp the power of local authorities. This seems like a weird point to make because, it's not so much about usurping their power, right? The federal government always has authority over state and local interests. That's the supremacy clause, right? The federal government is the daddy, is the king of the land. They have the final say. I think more specifically, and maybe it's the problem with their verbiage, but I think more specifically what they're referring to is the power of the executive. The executive branch of the government only has certain things that they are and aren't allowed to do, while the federal government and the president are the supreme, commanders or whatever. They aren't like kings. They don't have unlimited, unchecked power. So this verbiage is just a little bit weird. The battle over federal versus state authority is rooted in laws pertaining to presidential powers. The Posse Comitatus Act, as former United States Attorney General Joyce Vance explains, prohibits the federal government from using the military inside of the domestic United States for law enforcement, absent truly compelling circumstances. But there are exceptions. Title 10 of the U.S. Code fleshes them out, authorizing the president to federalize the National Guard and deploy it to a state in rare instances of invasion, rebellion, or the need to execute federal laws. In Portland in 2020, President Trump labeled the protesters terrorists and threatened to bring in the National Guard if the protests didn't stop. Yet days later, he pulled back from that threat, telling George Stephanopoulos on ABC News that such a move would have violated the law. "We have to go by the laws," he said then. "We can't move in the National Guard. I can call insurrection, but there's no reason to ever do that, even in a Portland case." He further concluded that we can't call in the National Guard unless we're requested by a governor. So it seems like he used to be against that. Interesting. How things have changed. On June 7th, Trump issued a memorandum declaring his authority to deploy both the National Guard and the armed services. In light of these incidents and credible threats of continued violence, the memo authorized the Secretary of Defense to coordinate with governors to deploy both the National Guard and any other members of the regular armed forces as necessary to augment and support the protection of federal functions and property in any number determined appropriate in his discretion. In other words, Secretary of Defense Pete WikiLeaks Hegseth has given unprecedented authority to direct events on the home front, challenging the Posse Comitatus Act's prohibitions. Since then, 4,100 National Guardsmen and 700 Marines have arrived in Los Angeles. Their presence has been notably aggressive. Meanwhile, Department of Homeland Security agents have swarmed the streets, local employment places, and immigration offices not wearing identifying insignia. As Nick Terse reported at The Intercept, since June 8th, there have been 561 arrests related to protests across Los Angeles. 203 for failure to disperse were made on the night of June 10th after Trump ordered in the National Guard and Marines. Meanwhile, Trump used the growing conflict to threaten Governor Newsom with arrest. One thing that keeps coming to mind for me with all of this is how Nixon or Reagan, whichever one of them started the whole Reefer Madness. I'm pretty sure it was Reagan. Started the whole Reefer Madness stuff. It came out much later that his whole explicit goal, the reasoning behind going so hard against marijuana and wanting to make it illegal, is basically to target his political rivals. He knew that a huge portion of Democrats, of liberals, of people, not voting for the Republicans at the time, smoked weed, and that a huge part of the hippie movement at the time, which was huge, was very, very heavily leaning towards the liberals, and that it would be very hard to beat them with that understanding. So they went after weed explicitly for the purpose of trying to arrest and get felonies on as many of those ostensibly mostly hippie smoking pot, so that they can basically help them electorally, right? If they could take 10,000 of them out of the voting pool because they got felonies, and 9,500 of those 10,000 would have voted liberal, well, that's pretty good for them. That's, they just effectively, changed the difference in the votes by 9,500. That's significant. And so I can't help but keep coming back to that like they do directly benefit, even on a very, very small scale, of arresting as many protesters as possible and slapping them with felonies and upping the charges as much as possible to the point that they're felonies so that they can not vote anymore. I just can't help but think that that is a goal of theirs somewhere in the mix, right? I have no reason to think that if Reagan was wanting to do that suddenly the Trump administration of all administrations is altruistic and good meaning and good intentioned and doesn't want to do that. Nobody believes that. Come on. Meanwhile, Trump used the growing conflict to threaten Governor Newsom with arrest. That's insanity, bro. Justifying his deployments. Just imagine for half a second, Kamala Harris was elected and she threatens to arrest Ron DeSantis. Just imagine for half a second. Okay, the conservatives would lose their minds. They'd be calling for impeachment. It would be World War III. It would be World War III. Okay, but they're not principled. They don't care. Justifying his deployments, the president labeled the protesters insurrectionists, laying the groundwork for invoking the Insurrection Act, which, as Joyce Vance explains, allows the military to be used for domestic law enforcement, but, and it's an important caveat, only to restore order. Yeah, but like all of these terms like restoring order and what is a national threat and what isn't and whatnot, all of these are extremely vague terms that it seems like the Supreme Court is more and more deferring to the executive to interpret, which is problematic. For help in pushing back against the deployments, California officials, like their Portland predecessors, have turned to the courts. This time around, however, the Trump administration has revised its reading of what is lawful, and so far, the judiciary seems to be bending the president's way. Exactly like I said, yeah. A lot of the readings, a lot of the provisions in this law, a lot of the verbiage is vague, and that ultimately that vagueness comes down to the court. And then a lot of the times recently, the court has just been kicking it back to the executive saying, oh, it's up to you guys. Do whatever you want. But if it was like, I guarantee you, if it was the shoe is on the other foot. If it was a liberal trying to do something like liberal oriented or whatever, there's no way on earth they're kicking it back to them. They're making a very clean ruling or whatever. They're going to use their major questions doctrine or whatever made up nonsense. They don't even have to make up anything, right? They have a majority on the Supreme Court. They don't even have to write majority opinions or dissenting opinions. They don't even have to do any of that anymore. They could just make their rulings and say nothing. On June 9th, Governor Newsom filed a suit in federal court claiming that the deployment of the National Guard and the Marines violated the Constitution and exceeds the president's Title X authority. The suit argued that the deployments were unwarranted and the administration had failed to try to coordinate with the governor. California Attorney General Rob Bonta. So now Bonta gets robbed. Now they treat Bonta correctly. They give him his first name. I guess he does have a first name. He's not just named Bonta. California Attorney General Rob Bonta elaborated on the limitations of the law. Let me be clear, there is no invasion, there is no rebellion. The president is trying to manufacture chaos and crisis on the ground for his own political ends. Federalizing the California National Guard is an abuse of the president's authority under the law, and not one we take lightly. We're asking a court to put a stop to the unlawful, unprecedented order. In 2020, the Oregon Attorney General had filed suit in federal court in response to the actions of the federal agents. As the New York Times reported, the lawsuit said federal agents were violating the First, Fourth, and Fifth Amendments to the Constitution by denying the right to peacefully protest, failing to provide due process, and conducting unreasonable searches and seizures. Ultimately, the federal judge dismissed the case, claiming that Attorney General's office did not have standing to bring the case because it had not shown that the issue was an interest that is specific to the state itself. The Oregon court also shied away from tackling the larger question of what powers the federal government actually had in such situations. Suits brought by private parties as well as the American Civil Liberties Union on behalf of individuals who were injured, harassed, or abducted by federal agents were more successful. Initially, a judge expanded a temporary restraining order from local law enforcement to federal agents, blocking the use of tear gas and projectiles against journalists. As the suit progressed, more weapons in the federal agents' arsenal, including rubber bullets, were prohibited. When the president asked for the TRO to be removed, the judge not only refused, but levied a requirement that government agents wear identifying insignia, an effort to introduce a measure of accountability into the conflict on the ground. It seems like inconceivable to me that they would not have the ICE agents or just any federal agents like clearly labeled what they are. To me, that builds the case for this chaos argument that he is using the National Guard, he is using these federal agents as a way to instigate chaos, as a means to justify sending in more and exerting more authoritarian executive control over these localities. Because if you are acting in good faith, if you really truly are acting in good faith and just want to use these federal agents to quell things, to go after immigration or do whatever it is that you're trying to do, that you're pretending to do, you would have them clearly labeled. You wouldn't want all of the problems that come along with them not being clearly labeled, right? To me, that shows that them not being clearly labeled is a deliberate choice. And why would you make that choice? It's to sow chaos. On appeal, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals raised the larger issue of federal versus local authority, resoundingly rejecting the legality of the presence of federal agents in Portland while agreeing with the lower court's findings of a disturbing pattern of unwarranted force by federal agents. That court not only reinstated the TRO against federal agents attacking journalists, but underscored the fact that federal agents had gone beyond protecting federal buildings to actively confronting protesters while widening the perimeter in which they could act outside those buildings and so wrongfully overstepping the authorities expressly reserved for local law enforcement. And at that time, there were also help from within Trump's circle. In a settlement arranged between Oregon Governor Kate Brown and Vice President Mike Pence's staff, federal law enforcement officers were indeed replaced with members of the Oregon State Police. As Nick Blosser, Brown's chief of staff and one of the negotiators, pointed out recently, referring to Vice President Pence, there was at least someone in the administration that knew that this violence needed to come to an end. I'm not sure who is there to negotiate with now. I would just love to ask, like all of the normie Trump supporters, why do you think Pence is not running with him anymore? Why do you think Trump did not choose Pence to be his vice president again? Okay, I would love to hear the wide range of weird answers that they give, because I guarantee you none of them are connected to reality. Today, in Los Angeles, the courts are similarly engaged in a suit over the administration's deployment of federal agents to counter protesters. So far, however, the outcome is trending very differently. Earlier in the month, a federal judge issued a TRO against the National Guard in that city. In a 46-page ruling, Judge Charles Breyer, the brother of retired Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, rejected the government's characterization of the protests as a rebellion and excoriated the president for assuming powers beyond his constitutional and statutory authority. That's the difference between a constitutional government and King George, was the way he put it. In addition, Judge Breyer returned the authority to deploy the National Guard to California rather than the federal government. The administration immediately appealed, as in the Portland case. The appellate court is once again the Ninth Circuit. On June 18th, there was a hearing before a panel of 3 judges, 2 of them Trump appointees and 1 a Biden appointee. Repeatedly, the judges seemed to reject the notion that the law requires the active involvement of the governor in the decision to deploy such troops, appearing to side with the federal government lawyer who told the judge again and again, our position is this is not subject to judicial review. In other words, the president should have free rein to do as he pleases. Basically, yes, they're arguing that the court does not have any standing over this and that it is up to the executive to interpret these laws as they see fit. Now, typically, this is where the court would come in and say, no. But because this is an extremely ideological court, they only do that when it's convenient and when they want to, especially the Ninth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit of Appeals is notoriously like ultra conservative and ultra insane and ultra ideological. In their ruling, the appellate judges agreed with Trump and not with the state of California, overruling the district court judge and unanimously agreeing that the president had acted lawfully and that his failure to notify the governor before deploying those troops was not grounds for obstructing the president's order. In other words, he could indeed keep control of the troops in LA. In short, the case has taken us another step down the road of the maximalist view of executive power. The ruling suggests that last year's Supreme Court immunity decision, allowing a president to do more or less whatever he wants while in office without fear of retribution, was indeed a game changer. As a reminder, in July 2024, while Trump was running for office a 3rd time, the court ruled that under our constitutional structure of separated powers, the nature of presidential power entitles a former president to absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority, and he is entitled to at least preemptive immunity from prosecution for all of his official acts, the court then added. There is no immunity for unofficial acts. That's the thing, though. How do you define the difference between unofficial and official acts? And I really, really, really do not trust the Supreme Court makeup that they will fairly and objectively and unbiasedly interpret what is an official and official, what is and isn't an official or official act. I guarantee you, I'm making a prediction right now. I guarantee you, the next time a Democrat is in office, they are going to make a series of rulings that are completely antithetical to the rulings they made under the Trump administration, that are exactly the opposite with regards to the amount of power they're giving to the executive. But nothing's going to matter, because there's absolutely, what are you going to do about that, right? There's nothing we can do about them being hypocrites or about them being cynical and ideological in that way or biased. There's literally nothing we can do. We just have to suck it up and deal with it. In the context of recent events in Los Angeles, rather than immunity for criminal activity, it suggests that the Supreme Court might indeed support immunity from legal pushback for acts it committed at the state level. And that would, of course, remove yet another of the checks and balances that once underlay the protections against untethered presidential power in the American system of government. How this will play out at the Supreme Court the next time around is anyone's guess, and may turn on the issue of whether that court assesses that there really was a rebellion in Los Angeles, the government's premise for bringing in federal troops. Nonetheless, this should certainly be considered a frightening moment. After all, that presidential memorandum authorizing the federal deployment to LA was in no way limited to California. In fact, there was no geographical specificity to it at all, and no specific type of protest named in the memo. It was a blanket authorization for deploying federal troops based on unspecified acts of violence, disorder, and protests. If California is a sign of the future, it seems ever clearer that the courts have little appetite for standing in the way of this president. In addition, as loyalty to him is the first requisite of government officials, any pushback from within the ranks of his administration seems essentially inconceivable. Yeah, because we've undergone a reverse Darwinian process to select for the most unqualified, insane people to be in this administration. Bro, if you look at the cabinet of people he had in his first term from 2016 to 2020 versus the cabinet of people he has now, bro, it was like the NBA All-Star team versus JV middle school team, right? Like we have the worst of the worst in office now. We have the maximalists of the opportunists, of the cynical corporate interests, of the disgusting religious ideologues and theocrats. It's tempting to point to the moments in recent times when we should have seen this coming. The growing powers granted to the president in the name of the global war on terror, the unchecked ability of the president to repeatedly make acting appointments and fire those in his cabinet who oppose his will, the co-opting of members of Congress through threats of primarying them out of office or grants of vast amounts of money should they demonstrate sufficient loyalty to the president. But as it stands, this is probably not the time to focus on who's to blame in the past. Instead, it's time to consider the future and our power to strengthen the fundamentals of our democracy before all is lost. Only if our trust in the law and the courts is restored will we truly be able to turn our thoughts to the mistakes and missed opportunities of what by then would be a painful past. The problem is restored if only our trust in the law and the courts is restored. But how could you possibly have the trust of the law and the Supreme Court restored if they're as ideological as they are, if they are as biased and clearly acting politically as they are? How could anybody possibly hope to? It's not a matter of trust, right? It's not like. So during the Biden administration, they made a rule that in credit reporting, you're not allowed to add medical debt to that credit report. So people's credit scores wouldn't be hit if they had medical debt. But apparently, a judge nixes a Biden rule in order to keep medical debt on credit reports. It seems like they're reversing the rule. Unpaid medical bills will remain on their credit reports after a federal judge last week vacated a Biden-era Consumer Financial Protection Bureau rule that would have removed such debt. Judge Sean Jordan of the U.S. District Court of Texas, Eastern District, found that the rule exceeded the Bureau's authority under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, agreeing with the arguments of two industry associations, which had filed a lawsuit against the rule that was later joined by the Trump administration. The court found that every major substantive provision of the medical debt rule exceeded the CFPB's authority, Jordan, a President Donald Trump appointee, wrote in his opinion. The rule, which the Bureau finalized shortly before the Biden administration left office in January, would have removed an estimated $49 billion in medical bills from the credit reports of about 15 million people. It would have also banned lenders from using certain medical information in loan decisions. That seems like a good thing to me. The rule would have also prohibited lenders from using medical devices, such as wheelchairs or prosthetic limbs, as collateral for loans and barred them from repossessing the devices if patients were unable to repay those loans. Oh my God, I can only imagine the idea of the idea that in the United States of America in 2025, somebody has to go on layaway, has to take out a loan to get a prosthetic leg for the accident they got, the car accident that was no fault of their own, and that they can't finish off the payments, and then the company who made the leg is going to come and repossess it. The whole idea of any of this, the whole concept of this happening in the United States is disgusting, and there's absolutely no reason for it, right? If we have the ability to not have this be the case, it is a choice. It is an active choice for us for this to be the way it is. It seems beyond disgusting. I'm physically disgusted at the idea of that. it is not that difficult or expensive. It is not like a tremendous amount of resources to create a prosthetic leg. All right, I understand there's lots of engineering and lots of R&D, and it does cost money to produce them, and that they're complex devices. But it's not like you're talking about 1 million tons of steel or something, right? It is a prosthetic leg. Like, come on. Why would you want to? Who does reversing that rule help? Who does reversing the rule that you can't repossess these medical devices like wheelchairs and prosthetic limbs from people who haven't finished off their payments? Who does this help? Does it help the disabled people, the handicapped people, the people who are needing to use a wheelchair, needing to having to use a prosthetic arm or a leg? Is it those people that's going to be helped by this change? Or is it going to be the millionaires and billionaires who own those companies who are maybe missing out on a small, tiny fraction of profit? Not enough to make their business unsustainable, mind you. No. These businesses are still there. The people who own them are still extremely rich. The people who work in them are still getting paid. These businesses are still very successful and have a very solid place in our economy and aren't going anywhere. But they could make a little bit more money. I guess this rule is keeping them from making a little bit more money. I guess that is the most important thing, right? Is ensuring that these executives, that it's maximizing their profits, right? If anything is even perceived as slightly unfair to them, that's a big no-no. Those with medical debt on their credit reports could have received a 20-point boost on average in their credit score, the Bureau said when issuing the rule in January. Also, the rule was expecting to lead to the approval of about 22,000 additional mortgages every year. Medical debt on credit reports is not a good predictor of a person's ability to pay other loans, the Bureau's research has found. Plus, healthcare bills often contain mistakes, which can lead to extended battles between patients, health insurers, and medical providers. I'm going to ask the exact same question as I am about the rule change regarding repossessing certain wheelchairs and certain medical devices, right? Who benefits most? Who benefits from this rule change, reversing the exemption of medical debt on credit reporting scores? Who benefits most from this? Is it the people that find themselves in medical debt? I would argue almost in all cases through no fault of their own. And I would argue because we don't have any sort of public healthcare system in the United States, a la any other first world country. But I ask the question, who benefits from this most? Is it going to be the people who have this medical debt and are struggling to get a car loan or struggling to get a house loan or maybe even struggling to get into a certain type of apartment or maybe even employment, maybe struggling to get a certain type of job because some employers do look at credit scores because they have this medical debt on their, through no fault of their own, ostensibly medical debt on their credit report? Who's going to benefit? Is it going to be those people who are being harmed by the way medical debt was reported? Or is it going to be the millionaire and billionaires who always seem to benefit from these sorts of changes? Is it going to be the lenders who can now give higher interest rates and more restrictive loans on these people than they otherwise would have? Is it going to be them? It's so hard to determine who benefits most in this. Is it going to be the millionaires and billionaires at the top of the insurance industry? Or is it going to be the average person with medical debt? It's a really hard question to answer, huh? It's extremely hard to answer. Also, if the Bureau themselves are coming out and saying medical debt on credit reports is not a good indicator of not a good predictor of a person's ability to pay back other loans, that seems like more than enough justification to do the change that the Biden administration implemented. I just can't think of any steel man reasonable justification for reversing this rule. The only justifications, the only steel man arguments I can come up with are sort of what I was alluding to, right? The idea that like putting as much money in the pockets of these millionaires and billionaires who run all these companies who are at the top of these industries is the maximum priority of this administration. There are no altruistic, people-centered changes that they're doing. Republican and industry pushback. Republican lawmakers voiced opposition to the rule soon after it was proposed last August. Several House Republicans wrote in Rohit Chopra, the Bureau's director at the time, to express their serious concerns that the proposed rule would weaken the accuracy and completeness of consumer credit reports. They argue, but it's not affecting it's not going to weaken the accuracy and it's not going to weaken the accuracy and competitiveness of consumer credit reports, because as the Bureau themselves just stated, medical debt on credit reports is not a good predictor of a person's ability to pay back other loans. So the idea that you have some sort of serious concern that this is going to weaken the accuracy and completeness of consumer credit reports is literally going against what the Bureau themselves are saying how it works. They argued that it would undermine underwriting processes, increase risk in the financial system, and harm access to and the affordability of credit for consumers, particularly lower-income Americans. America's financial system is the best in the world because it is based on a full, fair, and accurate credit reporting system, Dan Smith, the association's CEO, said in a statement. Information about unpaid medical debts is an important element in assessing a consumer's ability to pay. This is the right outcome for protecting the integrity of the system. America's financial system is the best in the world because it is based on a full, fair, and accurate credit reporting system. Well, my understanding is that the credit reporting system as it is now was basically invented in the 80s, that prior to the 1980s, we didn't really have a unified, nationwide credit reporting system like we do now. There was credit scores, and they did exist in some capacities, but my understanding was it wasn't so much for individuals, that it was for companies, for organizations, for governments, and that the idea of applying it on such a micro level to an individual wasn't necessary, right? And to say that none of these people would argue that like the financial system of the United States or our economic abilities were bad pre the 1980s, right? The United States got to where it is somehow, and we saw the biggest economic boom we ever saw in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And that was well before the credit score system was ever implemented on a micro level like we see now. So this is just a weird assertion that it's the best because of the credit reporting system. Well, I would argue that it was really good before the credit reporting system. So to argue that it's good because of it, it doesn't make any sense. It's ahistorical. And it's also like the association CEO, like big shocker. The association CEO is going to be making facetious claims about the role the credit reporting system plays in our overall economy and financial system. Why would anybody want to listen to what this guy has to say? Why would anybody care what Dan Smith, the Association of Credit Score People, has to say about the role credit score plays in the financial system? Why would you have any reason to think that he's doing anything but puffing things up, but fluffing it? The judge affirmed that the CFPB does not have the ability to write law, that it is the job of Congress. ACA International, which represents credit and collection professionals, said in a statement. A group of 30 Democratic and independent senators, however, say the rule would have helped consumers without reducing the accuracy of credit scores. They wrote a letter to Russell Vought, the Bureau's acting director, requesting information about its decision to ask the court to vacate the rule, including any communications with debt collection agencies. The industry has also taken steps to reduce the impact of medical debt on people's credit histories. In 2022, the three largest credit reporting agencies, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, announced they would remove nearly 70% of medical debt from consumers' credit reports. The agencies no longer include medical debt that went to collections on consumer credit reports once it has been paid off. That eliminated billions of dollars of debt on consumer records. So it seems like even the credit reporting agencies themselves took in the CFPB, or is it the CFPB that said that? Took in the understanding that medical debt on credit reports is not a good predictor of a person's ability to pay off the loans. So it seems like that is such a well-known principle that even the credit bureaus themselves are implementing it. In addition, unpaid medical debt no longer appears on credit reports after the first year, whereas the previous grace period was 6 months. That gives people more time to work with their health insurers or providers to address the bills.
And medical collection of debt of less than $500 is no longer included on credit reports. Plus, FICO and Vantage score reduces the degree to which unpaid medical bills impact credit scores. So yeah, this is just another one of a long string of changes and rulings and policy changes that this administration is making that to me seem very clearly helping one group over the other. And if we're going to differentiate these two groups, it's the rich owner class and it's everybody else, right? I can't keep coming back to the fact that so many of the rulings that this administration is going with, some of the ideas that they're rolling with, seem to only benefit the most wealthy, the most connected, the most powerful of people, the heads of industries themselves, but at the expense of what? Everyday people, like this medical debt change, right? This doesn't the change that the Biden administration put in, exempting medical debt from being put on credit reporting stuff, was both logical. It was both logical in that there was real justification for it, right? The Bureau themselves came out and said medical debt on credit reports is not a good predictor of a person's ability to pay for other loans. So it made sense from a logical perspective, but also from like a moralistic good thing to do perspective, right? You're helping out. And yes, very slightly at the expense of these large loan-based, credit reporting institutions, very slightly at their detriment, you are helping these people who are under medical debt, most of which I would say probably not their fault. But a reversal of this change does, like I said, it doesn't help regular people in any way, shape, or form. There is no steel man argument for how this helps the regular, everyday person with medical debt or whatever. This only helps the heads of industry, the executives, the insurance companies, the millionaires and billionaires who seek to make profit off of this sort of change. This story is absolutely insane. As far as I understand, there was a doctor that was giving people saline shots and lying, basically stealing the government. So that people would come in and get a COVID vaccine shot. He would say, all right, I'm giving you the COVID vaccine shot, fill it up with saline, basically salt water, inject them with salt water, and take the money for the COVID-19 vaccines, to take the payment money. Charges dropped against Utah doctor accused of destroying $28,000 in COVID vaccines. The federal government on Saturday dismissed charges against a Utah plastic surgeon accused of throwing away COVID-19 vaccines, giving children saline shots instead of the vaccine, and selling faked vaccine cards. U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi said in a post on the social media platform Twitter that charges against Dr. Michael Kirk Moore of Midvale, Utah, were dismissed at her direction. Moore and other defendants faced up to 35 years in prison after being charged with conspiracy to defraud the government, conspiracy to convert, sell, convey, and dispose of government property, and aiding and abetting in those efforts. The charges were brought when Joe Biden was president. Dr. Moore gave his patients a choice when the federal government refused to do so, Bondi wrote. He did not deserve the years in prison he was facing. It ends today. He gave them a choice. I mean, I don't know if he was asking them if they wanted saline shots or not. I have a feeling that isn't what is happening. He was just doing it without asking them. If he's doing it without asking them, he's saying he did not deserve the years in prison. He was saying he's giving them a choice. Dr. Moore gave his patients a choice. If he is choosing to give them saline instead of the vaccine, that's not a choice. What? I would love to see the details of this. I wonder if maybe he was asking them, because the verbiage is so weird here, right? It almost makes me think that like maybe he was asking, do you want a real one or not? I can fake it for you. I don't know. It doesn't make it any better if he was asking them or not. But the idea that gave his patients a choice when the federal government refused. Also gave his patients a choice. They always had the choice to not take it, right? They never were forced to take it. The idea that they didn't have a choice to not take the vaccine is crazy. Yes, taking it was coercive in some circumstances, but I don't think there's necessarily anything inherently wrong with that, right? Taxes are coercive, right? You technically have the choice to not pay taxes. You will eventually go to prison, right? Eventually, long enough down the line, you will find yourself in jail as a result of not paying taxes. And so arguably, you don't really have the choice to not pay taxes. It's you are being coerced into paying taxes. And within the context of the coercion, is that really a choice? But I don't think that is super meaningful within the context of the social contract, right? for the government and for society to function as it is in any way that we would even recognize, it requires everybody to pay taxes. It would not function if people had a choice to do so. It works the same way with this, right? We had a huge public health crisis, right? The COVID vaccine seemed like it was doing something, which it did do something. And so it was totally reasonable for us to put in certain measures to incentivize and to potentially even coerce people into taking it, right? And so people who whine and cry about, oh, the military forced the military members to get COVID. They didn't have a choice. They would have had to quit the army and blah, blah, blah. Bro, first off, with the army and the military pump you with so many drugs. When you're in boot camp and stuff, they're just sticking a needle in your arm and giving you whatever, and you're not allowed to say no. So the idea that like they aren't going to question whatever random stuff is being stuck in their arm at the beginning of boot camp, but like suddenly the COVID vaccine, they're all up in arms. Oh my God, you got to stop this. Is just so stupid and facetious and not a real serious argument. But yeah, if you're a healthcare professional and you're in your hospital you work at says you have to get a vaccine or you're being fired, yeah, that is coercive, but it's sort of like the no shirt, no shoes policy at stores, right? I mean, it's basically that, but for the whole country and with a certain vaccine at the time. I think the analogy between the vaccine and a seatbelt is extremely close. Dr. Moore gave his patients a choice when the federal government refused to do so, Bondi wrote. He did not deserve the years in prison he was facing. It ends today. Absolutely, he did deserve the years in prison. The idea that she would overlook defrauding the federal government if it was some liberal doing it or whatever for a liberal cause is... She wouldn't. There's no way they would. This is not about giving people the choice. This is not about usurping federal control. This is because you guys think COVID was a hoax, that you think is some weird liberal cabal Jew conspiracy to control you, to put Bill Gates microchips in you or some bullshit. That idea has permeated the Republican Party so much that they are willing to just like go completely off the deep end with this shit and start pardoning people who defrauded the government and gave people fake vaccines and lied about it? Bro, no. A federal grand jury on January 11th, 2023 returned an indictment against Moore, his Plastic Surgery Institute of Utah Incorporated, others associated with the clinic, and a neighbor of Moore's. The indictment alleged more than $28,000 of government-provided COVID-19 vaccine doses were destroyed. They were also accused of providing fraudulently completed vaccination record cards for over 1,900 doses of the vaccine in exchange for either cash or a donation to a specified charitable organization. The government also alleged some children were given saline shots at their parents' request so that minors believed they were getting the vaccine. That's super dangerous too, because like, not only is it like some sort of choice, take away the perspective of like the government's forcing you to get it and we want to give them a choice to not have to take it or whatever. If you are telling these kids, if people believe that they are getting this vaccine, they're going to act in such a way as if they had the vaccine, right? They might be a bit more willing to be around people, to not mask up, to go around old people or immunocompromised people that would especially be harmed if they were to catch the virus. So it seems especially dangerous that, like, a lot of these people didn't know they were being, especially the kids, they didn't know they were being giving fake saline shots. They thought they were getting the full vaccine and may potentially change their actions as a result of it. Potentially infecting more people and resulting in more illness and potentially more death as a result. Health Secretary Robert Kennedy Jr., a leading anti-vaccine activist before becoming the nation's top health official, posted his support for Moore in April, saying on X that Moore deserves a medal for his courage and his commitment to healing. What is happening? Do we live in La La Land? What is happening, bro? How is he the head of the Health and Human Services Department, bro? What is happening? Deserves a medal for his courage and his commitment to healing? He defrauded the government because he thought the vaccine was a hoax. That is... What are we doing here? What are we doing here, bro? We have the most insane people in office. I keep coming back to this reverse. We have undergone a reverse Darwinian process, and to select for the worst, most unqualified, most cynical, most corrupt people possible for this administration. I saw an interesting word. I'm gonna look it up right now, but it's called like There's a word for this. There's a word for when a government or a country or whatever is ruled by its least qualified and its least competent people. And that seems to be where we're at right now. It starts with a K. I can't remember the. During his confirmation hearings in January, Kennedy repeatedly refused to acknowledge scientific consensus that childhood vaccines don't cause autism and that COVID-19 vaccines saved millions of lives. In a follow-up Twitter post on Saturday, Bondi said Georgia Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene brought the case to her attention. Oh, yeah, of course. It's Bondi said Georgia Republican Marjorie Taylor Greene brought the case to her attention. That is not shocking at all. Like, she is the queen of this, like, insane conspiracy theory nonsense that is just, I would say permeated the Republican Party, but I would argue at this point is a core tenet of the Republican Party. And she is, like, the spearhead for that aspect of it. She's a spearhead for all the conspiracy theory nonsense that is, I'm saying, a core tenet at this point of the Republican Party. This just seems beyond. This is indefensible, though. There's no defense for this. And like I said, there's absolutely no conceivable way they would be giving the same kind of lenience or same kind of treatment for somebody, some liberal doing this for a liberal cause or whatever. They're only doing this because of all the conspiracy theory nonsense. They think vaccines are a hoax. They think, a lot of them think vaccines in general are a hoax, but they think, specifically the COVID vaccine was a hoax. It's some plot to control you, Bill Gates microchips in you, that kind of bullshit. So this happened a couple weeks ago, but it's still interesting to discuss. Cuban women's volleyball team denied U.S. visa to compete in Puerto Rico. The Cuban women's national volleyball team was denied a chance to play in a tournament in Puerto Rico following the new visa restrictions imposed by U.S. President Donald Trump. The Cuban Volleyball Federation said last week that the team, comprising 12 athletes, a referee, and several coaches, had their visa request denied and will be unable to attend the tournament later this month. Yeah, these are the people you want to be keeping out, right? The criminals, the criminals, the thieves, the rapists. Yeah, the Cuban Volleyball Federation. There's all the horrible organizations. We got to keep them out. They're invading us. We got to keep them out. The disappointment is huge because I train every day. Every hour of training is leading up to this and dedicate myself to it. National team player Laura Suarez told the Associated Press. It's really disappointing not to be able to participate in the competition, which is what I've been preparing myself for. It seems insane to me that they wouldn't give an exemption. I think any self-respecting, any administration that was actually acting in good faith would, even if they implemented some sort of rule with backwards ass reasoning that they want to restrict the visas and entrance from people from Cuba and these countries, anybody acting in good faith that got to that point, which I think would be pretty difficult too, but like, let's pretend that you are acting in good faith and your weird reasoning brings you to that point, you would provide an exemption for the Cuban volleyball team to come play in Puerto Rico, right? I mean, come on now. The idea that you wouldn't is purely xenophobic and purely racist. Cuba was scheduled to play in the Noreca Women's Final Four tournament in Manatí, Puerto Rico. The tournament includes Puerto Rico, Mexico, and Costa Rica, and it awards ranking points towards qualification for the Volleyball Nations League. We were focused on the competition because it's right there, said Diana Martinez, another player. Arriving at the embassy and being denied the visa affects us a lot because that competition gives us points to improve our ranking. The Cuban team's coach, Wilfredo Robinson, said the decision means his team is likely to miss out on the Nations League. The competition grants points for each match, and at the end, it all adds up, Robinson said. In September, we have another tournament, and if we get there needing to achieve 80 or 100 points, we are not going to be able to do it. The United States added Cuba to a list of 12 countries with restrictions for entering the U.S. or its territories, effective from early June. It includes nationals from Afghanistan, the Republic of Congo, Iran, Venezuela, and other nations. Denial of visas is part of a racist and xenophobic list of visa restrictions, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez wrote on his Twitter account. In a message sent to the Associated Press, the U.S. Embassy in Cuba stated that, according to its privacy policies, it could not comment on specific cases, but that directives were being implemented to secure the borders and protect U.S. communities and citizens. Yeah, you're really protecting U.S. communities and citizens by not allowing the Cuban volleyball team to compete. Bro, we were in such danger. I literally could not sleep for the last month with the idea that the Cuban Federation volleyball team is going to compete in that tournament. I literally couldn't sleep. I was at home. I had my gun just like this, just ready. I was ready. The Cuban women's volleyball team, they better not come in my door or they're going to get 9 shots of lead right through them. The Cuban women's national team won back-to-back world championships in 1994 and 1998. It also won 3 Olympic gold medals in a row in Barcelona in 1992, Atlanta 1996, and Sydney 2000. So, like, you couldn't make the argument like, oh, they weren't going to make it anyways. Not that that would be a valid argument in any serious person's mind, but, like, the argument that they wouldn't have made it anyway seems to not be true. If they were making they won the Olympic golds many, many times in a row. The U.S. measures are likely to impact many more Cuban athletes who depend on international competitions, including some on American soil to qualify for major championships and the next Olympics scheduled to be played in Los Angeles in 2028. Yeah, there's just no reasonable defense for this, man. This is insane. You could maybe come up with some good faith arguments for why you would want to restrict the visa entry for Cubans or whatever, but like to not provide exemptions for the freaking women's national volleyball team is just like, it shows the intention of all of this, right? It shows the intent of all of this. It shows where their head's at. They're leaning much more towards the xenophobic, racist side of things rather than the good faith. We just want to keep the bad people out sort of thing. Just stupid and insane and just mean. It's just mean for no reason. Why just let the stupid volleyball players play volleyball? Come on, man. This is ridiculous. The Supreme Court ruled last week that Trump can continue to break the law, both U.S. and international law, by having his secret police agents snatch people off American streets, disappear them into immigration prisons, then deport them to foreign concentration camps. Lacking national injunctions, this cruel and inhumane process can now only be stopped by one person at a time, one court at a time, at least until the 6 Republicans on the court get around to deciding a person's fate. And they're now on vacation until October. Oh, very convenient. When the Enabling Acts gave the Hitler regime the power to arrest people and disappear them into concentration camps, or worse, without judicial oversight, Heinrich Himmler came up with what he thought was a neat way to deal with political dissidents: night and fog. Nacht und Nebel was designed to instill such terror among the occupied population that it would cause people who might otherwise protest the Nazi violations of law and human rights to self-censor and remain quiet, as Himmler himself wrote. The Fuhrer is of the opinion that in such cases, penal servitude or even a hard labor sentence for life will be regarded as a sign of weakness. An effective and lasting deterrent can be achieved only by the death penalty or by taking measures which will leave the family and the population uncertain as to the fate of the offender. Deportation serves this purpose. Field Marshal Keitel was equally enthusiastic, writing, "Efficient and enduring intimidation can only be achieved either by capital punishment or by measures by which the relatives of the criminals do not know the fate of the criminal. The prisoners are," basically they're saying, we either need to kill them or do something to them so that they're effectively dead, i.e. deport them and don't provide any information at all so they're effectively dead. The prisoners are, in future, to be transported secretly, and further treatment of the officers will take place here. These measures will have a deterrent effect because A, the prisoners will vanish without a trace, and B, no information may be given as to their whereabouts or their fate. Pee Wee German, they're referring to Trump there, by the way, may well have studied this history, which my understanding is that he did. I've heard people say that he used to keep a copy of Mein Kampf by his bed, or that he read it, or that I have heard stories and anecdotes that Trump does, at bare minimum, appreciate and enjoy certain aspects of Hitler. As it appears, the U.S. deportation schemes to foreign hellholes like El Salvador and South Sudan are explicitly designed to produce terror amongst brown-skinned Americans. The group Human Rights First documented how disappearances are one of the main weapons being used by ICE to spread terror in immigrant communities. The Trump administration has used a pattern of disappearances to detain, remove, and expel people to countries which are not their countries of origin, and for which no removal proceedings have been conducted nor the required fear screenings. These actions are part of a broader effort to subvert due process and the checks and balances that are central to the U.S. Constitution. Among those impacted in the first few months of the administration have been countless asylum seekers, including people fleeing persecution by repressive governments, religious-based persecution, anti-LGBTQI attacks, and other harms. They ignored their own protocols on legal access and protecting children's rights to enact an expedient deportation they know to be unlawful. Not only that, they disappeared these families before any U.S. court could stand up for its children. We should all be mortified. Congresswoman and former chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus and regular guest on my radio TV program, Pramila Jayapal, chaired a meeting of the Immigration Enforcement and Security Subcommittee titled Kidnapped and Disappeared, Trump's Lawless Third Country Disappears. As you may expect, it featured testimony about people snatched by face-hidden thugs who were simply never heard from again. More than 500 people are believed to have been detained, many disappearing without trace for days or being quickly transported out of state. It is deeply troubling that immigration enforcement in the United States has reached a point where officials from the Trump administration openly advocated for tactics resembling forced disappearances that have characterized history's most obscene fascist regimes. Reports from civil rights groups and journalists have documented instances where individuals were taken off the street or from their homes without warning, transferred out of state, and left incommunicado from legal counsel or family for extended periods. These actions were not isolated errors. They are deliberate strategies aimed at instilling fear across immigrant communities, particularly those made up of black and brown people. What makes this moment even more alarming is the Supreme Court's recent ruling that strips lower courts of the authority to halt deportations or removals, no matter how unlawful or abusive. This is what we're going to cover in our next show. I tried to find an article on this, but I was struggling on the preparation for the show, so I'll make sure I find it before next show. But this, I would love to dive into this, but my understanding of what this is complete insanity, that the Supreme Court basically was like, yeah, y'all can't do your job and make lower court rulings because it might impact this administration and what, their ideological goals or whatever. With judicial oversight diminished, there's a clear and present danger that enforcement powers could be used arbitrarily and punitively. The use of fear, rather than a law, as a governing principle corrodes the foundation of due process and equal protection under the Constitution. Nonetheless, border czar Tom Hallman bragged, illegal immigrants should be afraid. History has shown us that when any government exercises the power to make people disappear as a tactic of social control, it opens the door to authoritarianism. It opens the door to authoritarianism? Isn't that like literally the definition of authoritarianism? You're already in the living room, baby. You're already well through the front door. Moral test of a democracy is how it treats its most vulnerable, not how aggressively it punishes them. In light of this ruling, resistance may now fall on the shoulders of citizens, legal advocates, and local governments to uphold basic rights that the federal system appears increasingly willing to ignore. We cannot look away, particularly since 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court just abdicated their responsibility to enforce the law and the Constitution. This is the moment to stand up, speak out, and organize. It drives me crazy when people are like all about vote, vote, vote. You got to participate, man. You got to participate in the system. You got to go out and vote, 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 vote. For all of these reasons why, the government's oppressing you. You could have free health care, or you could not have this authoritarian fascist stuff going on. But they don't take the logical, important next step and tell you who to vote for or who not to vote for. Right? And this is an opinionated article. There's no reason they need to try and pretend to be apolitical and just be like one of those people who's just signing people up for votes and they have to pretend to be apolitical. Like, I'm not here to tell you who to vote for. Just sign people up, try and get people in the process. You don't have to pretend to do that because this is an opinionated article. You can make it clear the Republicans are the ones doing this and those are the people you should not vote for. And therefore, while the Democrats are not great, They are the only alternative to this, and they are the only thing that is not for this. So you should vote against the Republicans and vote for the Democrats if you think all of this, if you read this article and resonate with it. But even the person who wrote this article is stuck in that brain rot idea of like, when you talk about advocating for voting, the idea of then saying who you should vote for is like a step too far or something. I think it's an important step to be made, because then people can be tricked, right? Somebody could read this article. It's totally conceivable. Somebody could read this article, think it's bad, and be like, oh, I don't want to vote for a leader who does that. But then 3.5 years from now, when it comes time to elect the next president, they're basically tricked into thinking that the Dems are really the ones doing this, and that the Republicans are the ones that want to stop this kind of thing from happening. No, but if this person in this article would have made it clear that Republicans are the ones that support this and the Dems aren't, and that's how you should vote when they're advocating for voting, maybe this person wouldn't make this mistake in the future. I don't know. Yeah, just absolutely insane, and just rank authoritarian fascism, man. I need to look more into what Trump thinks about Hitler, but I have heard some anecdotal things that he, read Mein Kampf or appreciates certain aspects of Hitler. I need to do more research into that, because there might be a serious connection there that I haven't put enough effort into. Man, it is so hot. It is absolutely boiling. I should have put on sunscreen. Alrighty. Well, it has been Tuesday. Is it Tuesday? Wait a minute. It is Tuesday. It has been Tuesday, July 15th, 2025. I am Michael Winkler, and this has been The Mike Wink Show. Peace out, y'all.